Hi everyone, welcome to week 10, module 11, the content-based lecture on contemporary American Indian arts and postcolonialism. This is our last lecture for the course. I want to start off with a little bit of a preamble about what I'm doing here in this lecture. Up till this point, we have kind of consistently followed the trajectory of identity politics when we're talking about various groups by looking in particular at moments early on in minority cultures' representation of themselves, at moments in which these cultures oftentimes seek precedents, kind of authentic moments of their culture that predate colonial contact, whether that be African slavery, whether we looked at feminist artists seeking out in matrilineal cultures precedents, or many other instances, of course. This lecture is not going to do that, although in a way, Native American or American Indian arts of the present are dominated by an interest in creating traditional art forms so as to link these cultures to their pre-colonial past, a kind of idea of seeking out this pure moment of the culture before it was assimilated into the dominant culture or manipulated by the dominant culture. And what I mean by this is that, you know, we live in the Northwest. I'm sure most of you can look around, Seattle and outlying areas and find any number of examples of a very vibrant scene of American Indian artists producing works of art that in one way or another continue these traditional art forms, whether that be language, performative art forms like dances and rituals, carvings such as totem poles, and on and on and on. And so you can find that everywhere, and that's certainly the dominant field. Remember, the importance of this strategy is to create a constituency around a moment in which this culture was, whatever culture it is, and now we're talking about American Indians, in which this culture had not yet been contacted by Western culture, had not yet been colonized by Western culture. And I think we're all familiar with the reasons that this is so important at this stage. However, in the lecture for today, I'm looking at the work of Fred Wilson, who is part Native American, part black, part white, kind of mixed race man, who is dealing particularly with the question of how cultures get represented by museums. And he created a work called Mining the Museum in the early 1990s that turned the museum into a space for contemplation and reflection upon how minority cultures are represented according to particular ideological stances that may or may not be visible to the museum goer. In other words, what I'm looking at in this series of analyses of artists is the question of an alternative to seeking out a truth or an authentic moment that exists pre-colonial contact in these cultures, and looking instead at artists who contest the very idea of authenticity, of the idea of a purity of an ethnicity or a culture that can be returned to, and they offer alternatives. And that continues through the work of Jimmy Durham, who is a Native American artist, and James Luna, as well as I threw in one artist who I'm very interested in, who is a local, Brian Youngin, who works out of, or used to work out of, primarily Vancouver, BC, and still is represented up there. So we're going to be looking at a whole different set of questions than you might expect, but it's only because we have skipped past a longer lecture that would look at the vibrant scene of Native American artists who are dealing with or evoking and continuing to use traditional art forms in their own work here. And the reason, again, is to give us a kind of broader field of questions by which to look at identity politics in the contemporary age. So we'll start here with Fred Wilson's work, Mining the Museum. And what you see on the screen is the first room that you would have entered when you walked into this exhibition. So let me set it up for you a little bit. All museums have what are called mission statements. These mission statements are a very short, usually a paragraph long explanation of the key goals of that institution. When we think about historical museums, and Fred Wilson's Monument Museum took place in the Maryland Historical Society's museum, we often think about museums or cultural institutions that are striving their best to represent a minority culture. In this case, it's not necessarily minority cultures in the first instance, or just culture at large from a supposedly neutral standpoint. If you've ever walked into a museum, particularly the Seattle Museum is a great example of this, and noticed how in the Seattle Art Museum's example, all the modern sections, the works are hung separated from one another with little wall plaques next to them on a white wall. And you think about this in terms of the readings, I think you'll understand that a museum has been set up during the modern age to make you think that what you're seeing and what you're absorbing, all the information that's given to you is coming from a neutral standpoint, one that is scholarly and objective and so forth. But there are very few places that we are able to see the perspective on the material that is being put forth. We don't see the things that aren't included. We don't get alternative views of the objects under our contemplation. After all, you know, the museum is the expert. We go there expecting to hear from those experts, and oftentimes we don't think, what are the other perspectives onto these objects or onto this culture that might be proffered to us in these spaces. In Minding the Museum, Fred Wilson, as a young artist, was working with a museum without walls called the Contemporary. And he found the Maryland Historical Society, which is in Baltimore, to house a project that he proposed. And this project was one in which, first we have to start from the actual institution, the Maryland Historical Society. It was an institution that was having very low attendance for its day. For those of you who don't know, Baltimore is a particularly vibrant African-American scene, and this historical society really wasn't speaking to this constituency in any way that resonated with them, because it was telling the story of Baltimore and its history from a very particular perspective that Fred Wilson wanted to draw our attention to and leave room for us to think about and to dialogue about and to contest. So the Minding the Museum project was one in which every single object and painting that you see in this lecture came from the holdings of the Maryland Historical Society. In other words, they owned these things. These were accessioned into their collection, but many of the objects weren't shown, and they certainly weren't shown in the configuration or in the kind of composition of the exhibition that you'll see Fred Wilson put out there in front of you. So what was the mission statement of the Maryland Historical Society in the first place? So I'll just read you something that's also in your reading. The Maryland Historical Society was founded in 1844, so right at the tail end of the Civil War. And it was incorporated to and founded to collect, preserve, and study objects and documents related to the state's history in reference to any remarkable event or character, especially biographical memoirs and anecdotes of distinguished persons. The mission included histories of colonization, slavery, and abolition, and any facts or reasoning that may illustrate the doubtful question of the origin of the North American tribes. The museum intended to tell those stories from the point of the view of the Society's all-male founding board. They conceived of the institution as, quote, a club serving their social and intellectual needs, end quote. Its first exhibitions were presented exclusively for members. In keeping with the, quote, social aspects of the original society, membership has expanded in this century, according to a past president writing in 1987, to include women and children. So just from that mission statement, what we hear is that the Maryland Historical Society was founded in order to give voice to the history of Maryland through objects collected. But what we also hear in that preamble is that it was only telling one perspective onto these objects. And what Fred Wilson wanted to do is draw our attention first to the way that museums, while they say that they are objective, are not. None could be, right? Nothing comes from a neutral perspective. And second, that the stories that are being told omit entire histories of people of color in particular. So what we'll be doing here in the lecture is walking through virtually these spaces in as much as that's possible with a few slides. So when you walked into the first room, then one of the first things you saw was this object, which, believe it or not, is a trophy for truth in advertising, which right off the bat might strike you as a total oxymoron. What exactly is truth in advertising? But in big bold letters, we see the word truth, and of course we're put on our guard to think, what is truth, and how is truth produced, and how is it contingent upon particular perspectives and ideological assumptions, things that we've covered so far in this class pretty well, I think. Also, when we look at this, those of you who are in the know will recognize that the globe that we're seeing is not particularly accurate when it comes to the representation of truth. Many people have pointed out that the typical globe and the way that it's set off oftentimes emphasizes the Western world in placing the Southern world below this, emphasizing the size of Europe and North America, putting North America on top and the rest of these countries down below, and on and on and on. Even the visual representation then of cartography and the globe has a particular perspective to it. This is Fred Wilson himself. I just wanted to show you this artist who continues to produce today, although mainly objects at this moment, and the museum catalog for mining the museum itself. This is a major, major landmark exhibition, and one that came about during some pretty substantial changes in museum practices as well as curatorial practices, and absolutely has impacted curatorial and museum practices since its inaugural exhibition. After seeing Truth in Advertising trophy, one of the first rooms that you walked into showed you three sculptural busts here of three very important people in history. These are all marble busts. They're all set off on plinths, as they often are, and the people who are represented are Henry Clay, Napoleon Bonaparte, and Andrew Jackson. Now, in some sense, the kind of silly question that one might ask is, besides being, white men in particular kinds of positions of power in their own lives and having a big impact on history, what else do they have in common? And the answer is that none of these sculptural busts really represents Maryland, since none of these men are Marylanders. Set off next to these, right off to the side, were three empty stands and empty plinths with no sculptural busts on them this time, but with little markers of the absence of these figures, all of whom come from Maryland and all of whom are people of color: Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and Benjamin Banneker. Now, this is one of the most difficult things, of course, to see, and I mean this not just in terms of visuality, but also metaphorically, to see anywhere, and that's the omission of various histories, the omission of people of importance. If they're not shown in a museum, sometimes we forget that they ever exist, and this partakes of that very important topic within identity politics of making visible the underrepresented. So right off the bat, when we walk into this museum, we're set on alert about truth and how truth is produced, and our attention is drawn to the omission of particular histories in these cultural institutions. As we move our way through the museum exhibitions, from one space to the next, each room is set up with a particular theme. And that theme, of course, continues this questioning of the museum as a neutral space and gives, hopefully, voice, or at least a space to reflect upon the voice of others. So one of the next first spaces was this space here, which includes Native American figures. It's of cigar store Indians and cigar store owners. So what we see here in this space are, typical cigar store Indians, usually wooden sculptures, painted very vibrantly, and all partaking of some pretty typical stereotypes of what Native Americans look like. These things originally were products of the 19th century. They continued well into the 20th century, primarily as advertisements for small stores that sold tobacco, a way to draw people in. They face off against, putatively, photographs of either people who might be understood as the owners of tobacco shops or little kind of corner stores, or authentic Native Americans, whatever that might mean, because none of the photographs that these face off against look particularly like the stereotypes of Native Americans. And I usually, when I'm teaching this class face-to-face, have everyone pause for a minute and just think, when someone says Indian or American Indian or Native American, what images fill your head? And if they're filled with images of, headdresses and moccasins and teepees and totem poles and so forth, there's a reason for that. It's been so repeated, these stereotypes, that you kind of can't get away from them. You just think immediately through that stereotype onto this culture. But what Fred Wilson is asking us to think about is how these images, these stereotypes, differ from real people. How, in a sense, the stereotype here is more a representation from the standpoint of the culture doing the representing, in this case, Western white culture, than it is in any way a representation accurate to the people it purports to represent. So here we see this facing off against kind of random portraits of people who may or may not have Native American ancestry in their blood, asking the question, what is the difference between these stereotypical representations and real people? And even further, in what way do the stereotypes of Native Americans that are so persistent continue to inflect our way of seeing this other? And how, in fact, do the stereotypes kind of enforce a relationship of self-other or otherness upon Native American cultures? This room's a little bit more difficult to explain. In this room, there was an entire setup of paintings that showed, they're primarily 19th century, some are 18th century paintings of the young master or the family, the white family, usually plantation southern families, in which there are what are known as pendant figures in these, people of color. So we see that here. This is actually a kind of close-up of a larger painting in which we see the young master dressed very nicely. He's been out hunting. He's been accompanied, one presumes, by the young black boy off to our left, his right. When this painting is not so focused in on, it's hard to even see the person of color, but I think now that we've kind of highlighted that, you see an inequitable relationship here, or a relationship of dominance and power versus one of the slave here, who literally has his collar still on him here. Now, along with highlighting this through lighting, the lighting would shine directly on the face of these people of color in these larger paintings. The gallery also contained audio, asking questions like, who am I to you? Am I your brother? Am I your friend? Am I your pet? To ask questions about what the relationship is, and to really get people to think about this visual representation of dominance and submission of the master, literally, and the slave here, that are everywhere to be seen in these images, but we tend not to focus on this figure who is not the focal point, the person of color, and rather just focus on that master image. So in the catalog itself, which we see here, that was highlighted by these kinds of cutouts. So you can see the verbiage here. Who am I? You know, am I your brother? Am I your friend? Am I a pet? How do I relate to you? And then when this was closed, that catalog was closed, it would highlight only that figure, the person of color, so as to really focus on the question of the visual representation of dominance and the lack of power here. In addition to that, many of the paintings in this room came out of the collection from a space that were devoted to paintings that have been damaged. Now, in the reading, you'll read more about this, but damaged paintings are a bit of a problem for museums, especially museums that don't have a lot of money and can't afford to conserve or to fix these paintings. And so they end up being kind of like the dirty little secret of a museum, an entire space filled with paintings that can't be displayed because they're too damaged, but the museum can't afford to display them or to conserve them, so as to show them. They just kind of get sequestered off into a dark space and everyone forgets about them. Now, Fred Wilson brought these damaged paintings out, and what you see here is a damaged painting of what probably was originally a white man, almost assuredly a white man. But he's placed a photograph found in the museum itself as well of a black man in the space of the damaged section of the face. What he's trying to do is correlate the idea of kind of hidden secrets or dirty little shameful secrets, the museum's shameful secret of works of art that can't be shown because they're too damaged, as well as the dirty secret, and again, I'm speaking metaphorically, I don't mean this to be really a dirty secret, of mixed race in white culture. This is something that, of course, we saw before with Adrian Piper's work, Cornered, where she draws attention to the fact that race itself is a contested category. There is no purity of the races. Most people, of course, come from mixed racial heritages, and race itself is, of course, a problem in that there is, again, no purity or no authenticity to those races. It is, by most people's, well, I shouldn't say most people, by a lot of people's thinking today, a really problematic category for, placing people in. So what he's done here then is he has substituted, in a sense, the white face for a black face underneath it to draw attention to the way that race is not a pure category, that many of us are of mixed racial heritage, and if that is the case, then what do we do with the category of race? How do we think about our own prejudices if they show up in terms of racism or white supremacy or what have you? This is the photograph of the man in the background there of the photograph that is placed behind the painting itself then. Here are some more of the paintings taken from the catalog page from this book. It's a little bit like a Where's Waldo image. Find the person of color in these paintings. Once you're alerted to their presence, you start looking for them everywhere and thinking about, how these works that are all about the privilege of the white family function in terms of the dominant white culture in the center, and the people of color who frame them. This is almost a visual representation of the so-called master-slave dialectic, in which, of course, you need the slave here in order to confer the superior status onto the people of that are not of color, the white families that are represented here. So here. And this shows you the entire museum space, this room devoted to this question. One of the most powerful images that came from the exhibition Mining the Museum by Fred Wilson was this one. It's in another room now. Every space had its own kind of thematic, and in this room we have a room that was organized around the theme of metalwork. In metalwork and modes of transport that are also shown here, what we see are these beautiful repoussoir silver vessels, from cups to goblets and so forth, pitchers. And For those of you who don't know, of course, these are objects that would have been proudly displayed in the Maryland Historical Society, of course, because silverwork was one of the most kinds of artsy forms of the 17th, 18th century in the United States. You know, even Paul Revere was a silversmith. And so the East Coast has tons of these things everywhere. But what people don't think about so much is how did this kind of beautiful luxury cultural object derive? What platform or foundation allowed this economy of incredible luxury to exist? And what we see here is that Fred Wilson has displayed these works of silverwork now next to something that the Maryland Historical Society probably wouldn't have exhibited, or certainly not in this orientation. Right in the center of these objects are slave shackles. Someone had donated these to the museum. They had been accessioned, meaning brought into their collection, but were probably rarely displayed, if at all, because they're so controversial. In this case, the juxtaposition may make you think, and this is something that Fred Wilson talked about himself in numerous lectures around this image, about how that luxury culture of the plantation South and how, frankly, the economy of the United States would have never got going without access to basically free labor through the enslavement of so many people, primarily West African cultures. So what we're then showing here, or making visible, is the kind of hidden underside that allowed for the production of these beautiful objects, that allowed the United States to get going in the first place, economically speaking. The dirty history of slavery in the United States, this one of two major abominations that founded the United States: the enslavement of people of color, and of course the mass eradication and displacement of the native populations of North America, Native American or American Indian populations. In the same room then, modes of transport, we also see modes of transport. And these modes of transport are, again, basically, you know, we've got a baby carriage in the foreground. We've got something that is a carrier for upper class people right in the middle here, that gives us, you know, forms of transport that were devoted to the upper classes of Plantation South in particular. But he's juxtaposed these with some pretty resonant objects as well. In the baby carrier, we see this costume. I don't know what the hell you call these things. You know, the hood and the white sheet of the Ku Klux Klan in one of these baby carriers. And if you think about this in relation to some of the photographs that are on the walls around this object and these other modes of transport, many photographs that look a lot like this, I think you get his point. In this photograph, we see two African-American women flanking two young white kids here, one of whom is in a baby carriage. And I think what Fred Wilson wants us to be thinking about here is how these mammy figures, which is really what we're seeing here, kind of photographs of African-American women, you know, playing this role, being stuck in this role, so to speak, raising possibly their future oppressors, members of white supremacist groups, and why that occurs. At this point, let me just pause and say that this museum exhibition was set up to provoke and to catalyze dialogue around these issues. So these are very, you know, important representations, very interesting juxtapositions, but they aren't necessarily condemnations of the past. They're more interested in provoking questions about the present and what we do with the fact that this is our shared history in the United States, how we bring in this history to museums in a way that will promote dialogue and hopefully some type of, awareness of the misrepresentation or outright omission of the histories of people of color in the United States. Also, in modes of transport, we see a lot of these objects. In the left-hand side of the screen, you see a ship. This is a beautiful model ship that is in relation to the reward signs for slaves, probably framed as a type of transport ship that could bring slaves. It's not necessarily that, but because it is juxtaposed with these, we start thinking about how people of color were taken from West Africa primarily and brought to the United States, and what their life was like once they got here. These reward signs, I'm not going to go through them all with you, but please pause in the lecture and read over the verbiage in these and note how people of color are represented in these reward signs. What are what is the vocabulary used? How are these people spoken of in the language? How simply are they represented by that language? I'll show you a few of those coming up. Here we see another very interesting juxtaposition. At the top, you see an idyllic scene of plantation life. These you can find all over the South. They're everywhere to be found. If you kind of zoom in on this, you'll see these two people kind of hoeing a field. It looks idyllic and peaceful, and no one looks angry. It doesn't necessarily look like that hard of work, and the slave driver, that kind of overmaster, is standing up on a stump or something of that sort, overseeing the whole thing, having a smoke, and everything's peaceful and idyllic and looks wonderful. And this is a way of kind of pacifying or misrepresenting the actual relationship, of course, to master to slave and the incredible difficulties of working a plantation. It's all just kind of erased by these idyllic representations that, of course, come from the standpoint of people in power. But he wants to bring up that kind of dirty history again and the difficulty of slave life by showing you in front of this, in a glass vitrine, a little sculptural object of a black man. So at the bottom of the screen here, this image, this is a little sculptural object that is what is known as a bootjack. You put it on the back of the heel of your boot to pull your muddy boots off so that you don't have to get your own hands dirty. And it's in the shape of a black person, a person of color here, used to literally pull one's boot off, and then it's juxtaposed against a reward sign for slaves, which, again, make us aware that these people were owned. They were literally owned by someone else, and their life was not in any way under their own power. So that idyllic scene of the pastoral life of plantations is running headlong into the reality of a slave's existence by this juxtaposition. A punt gun here, just to show you the violence that was involved with all these reward signs against it. In the background, these were oftentimes loaded with shot or even what is known as rock salts to shoot slaves, to bring them back into slavery if they had absconded, if they had escaped. And of course, you will read about this in your reading, the use of language and these reward signs next to the punt gun that is displayed here. And then the thing that always kind of kills me, that brings a lot of this to reality, we see the registrar or the inventory for tax purposes of Caleb Goodwin here. And on one side, on the left-hand side, we see things like the objects that he owns and grass that he has and fields that he owns and their valuation. Then on the right-hand side, we see the slaves that he owns and what their valuation here. And it really, makes more real than any kind of story could tell how people were owned by other people, how people of color, because of particular ideologies of their their lower kind of genetic makeup were deemed to be people that could be owned by someone else. And, you know, when you see a juxtaposition of a person on the right next to a field of grass on the left, you really get the idea of their object status, of just how real this was. Now read through the valuation of slaves on the right. You know, a young, strong Negro boy, $600, but, you know, not quite halfway down, you see one Negro woman, Hannah, 73 years of age, who is now worth $1. Some more of these reward signs. Again, I'm going to go through these quickly, but I would like it if you paused and kind of read through these and notice how, in a sense, this is like profiling. You know, it's a reduction of a person to these simple little visual markers so that they can be identified and brought back for reward. Now, I should also say with these that there was a bit of a cottage industry around capturing escaped slaves. And so you'll see at the bottom, oftentimes, a list of, you know, as we see here, the different amounts of money that you will receive if you bring this slave back. So taken in the city, $20, it says at the bottom. If 30 miles from Baltimore, $30. If 40 miles, $40. And if out of the state, and so forth. Now, many slaves might have escaped and then been taken 40 miles plus outside of the city so that the slave capturer could make more money off of that slave's return. Cabinet making, beautiful, beautiful objects, usually furniture in the space. Again, just like the silver work that we saw before, these beautiful chairs here that are all set up are something that would be proudly displayed in everyday exhibitions by the the Maryland Historical Society. However, in this juxtaposition, we see those beautiful luxury items facing off against a whipping post. Now, you know, whipping post, I'm sure if you've seen any historical movie, you'll be familiar with these as a way to punish slaves so that they will toe the line. An incredibly vicious, violent form of sustaining the inequitable or unequal relationship between whites and blacks here. But what most people don't know is that these continue to be used right into the 20th century. This whipping post was used in front of City Hall, in front of the Baltimore City Jail, until 1938. Now, that history wasn't something that most people are aware of, or that many of us in the United States are aware of. Somehow, we seem to think that post-Civil War, oftentimes, you know, things like this didn't get used until we plug into that history and we learn all about the persistence of racism in the United States right up through Jim Crow and into the present with the Black Lives Movement and its major retaliation and agitation against the treatment of young black males, in particular by police these days. I just bring this in as a kind of end cap. It's a little bit whimsical, but it cracks me up every time I see it. It's this beautiful dollhouse that one presumes was created for a young white girl in this culture and was filled with various figurines. Well, Fred Wilson has refilled this space with figurines taken out of knick-knack kind of blackface culture. These are all racial stereotypes. We see in the center the mammy figure, an extreme blackface with incredibly white eyes and big red lips and so forth. Now surrounded by objects that goodness knows how these got into the collection, things that look like, you know, some kind of weird composite African figurine of some kind of tribal life who protect her. It's almost like the white masters who are in the background have left and this mammy figure has taken over the space and now is protecting herself with these little figurines, this kind of mise en scène or something of that sort. While off to the other side, the master looks in from another room wondering what the hell is going on, right? What happens when, power gets into the hands of people of color and so forth. The museum exhibition had a huge impact, of course, and everything was set up so as to create the museum as a space of dialogue, including what you see here. You were invited to do exit polls or basically respond to a series of questions about how this museum was working, how this exhibition was working, and what you thought of the works on display. And the responses were quite mixed. As you see here, when touchy subjects are brought up, and I'm presuming this is a white writer here, although I can't know that, people get very touchy about the fear that this will incite violence and hate in young blacks. And we see that person voicing that opinion here. Like, somehow, if we just leave this history in the past and no one talks about it, we'll all forget about it, and none of the repercussions of the colonial period will persist in the present, which seems to me to be a really naive view of the continued problems in the United States. Other people were a lot more persuaded by Fred Wilson's approach here. You can pause and read these over as you wish. I want to turn now to the representation of Native Americans in the past, before going on to look at the work of James Luna, Jimmy Durham, and Brian Youngin. And I just want to show you some of the, and very quickly, some of the kind of stereotypical representations that are part of our nation's history of Native Americans, particularly in painting here, although I find it a really useful exercise to think, those of you who are familiar with Western movies and how Native Americans were represented in Western movies, and how that representation changed over time. So, for instance, if you think back to the old spaghetti westerns and how the stereotypical Native American was represented there, or you think of, I don't know, the Lone Ranger and Tonto and what that relationship was, and I mean that before the Johnny Depp version, which is its own weirdness. And then go all the way up to something like Dances with Wolves, where we get right around the same moment of time in the artists that we'll be looking at, Western filmmakers thinking back through representations of Native Americans and trying to create an alternative, more romanticized version of Native Americans, one that humanizes them, but still preserves a kind of inequitable power relationship or cleans up that history. Those of you who've seen Dances with Wolves, I mean, just think about it for a moment. That is a story that's being told from the standpoint of a man who, kind of the white man who does it right, who actually sees the Sioux people as human, understands all of their, all of their complexities and tries to do it right. And we, in a sense, are set up to kind of get rid of some of our white guilt around that by living vicariously through that character who does it all right. And of course, that isn't really our history. So I start here then, before looking at these three artists who are contesting the idea of returning to a kind of authentic mode of visual production, by showing some of the stereotypical representations of Native Americans that are, in this case, from the first half of the 19th century. What you're looking at here is a work by John Vanderlyn. You don't need to remember this work for anything other than an object example called The Death of Jane McCrae, which comes from a very famous, it was a painting that was produced as an illustration for a very famous epic poem by Joel Barlow called The Columbiad, which is a poem that tells the epic story of the kind of the founding of the United States during, of course, the early moments, going all the way back to the Mayflower and coming all the way up to the American Revolution. And in one of those episodes of this epic poem, there's a story about two Mohawk warriors who had been paid by the British to create havoc on the eastern seaboard by just hacking up defenseless people. As a type of representation, we oftentimes refer to this as the representation of American Indians as demonic, as entirely savage, as, just filled with violence and not something that could be in any way fixed. And so it helped to as these things were represented, it helped for us to represent Native Americans as these kind of demonic figures when we were seeking to push them off of their lands and to take what was originally theirs. And it's not surprising that these things crop up right around the same time period that we began the practice of moving Native American populations onto reservations. So, there is no direct correlation, but it's certainly right there, right at the same time. And what I'm saying then is, if you represent another people as demonic, as, filled with savagery that can't be tamed, then it makes it okay to go out there and, to be violent, to push them off their lands, to somehow contain them. It establishes this kind of paternalistic relationship between American Indians and white culture. It's also worth pointing out, of course, that the person who's being hacked up is a defenseless white woman, and this fits into a lot of the mythology of Native Americans. I don't know if you can see this, but if you look at poor Jane McCrae, you'll notice that she's having a wardrobe malfunction. Her breast is popping out here. It would have been too vulgar to represent these Native Americans as actually sexually assaulting her, but it is implied. And if you think back to representations, whether this be in books, the books that start with James Fenimore Cooper's leather stocking tales, such as The Last of the Mohicans and The Pioneers and such, all the way through the present, the number of times that we see the idea of Native Americans sexually assaulting white women is really dominant. That's another way for us to demonize them. So this is part of our history of representing these peoples according to our own ideological, the things that would make this, profitable to us in some pretty important ways. The most kind of common representation of Native Americans is what you see over there on the left. This is a work by Charles Bird King called, it's a long kind of ponderous title. Little Pawnees is what we'll refer to it as. And then over there on the right is a work by Karl Bodmer, who's actually a Swiss artist who was employed in the United States to represent Native American cultures. On the left, then, we see the stereotypical representation of Native Americans according to something that I really want you to think about here, our own projective identification or romanticization of these peoples. The composite view of these figures off there on the left, that's probably only two people represented in multiple different kinds of perspectives. Show them in all of their regalia, all their ceremonial regalia, and does everything that it can to kind of primitivize them, because this is what was seen as very interesting to white culture of this time, the idea of their exotic nature. We were really, really fascinated by their body painting, their hairstyles, their modes of dress, their ceremonial garb, and so forth. And so when they would come, and this is how Charles Bird King worked, when they would come to Washington to treaty with the federal government, they were asked to dress up in kind of their most traditional garb so that they could be painted and memorialized in these paintings. And then they were given, and you can see this here if you look at the main character here, his necklace, that is a peace medal that was given to Native Americans when they treated with the federal government. They're always stamped with the president who awarded that peace medal. And it's a symbol of their assimilation into white culture, kind of even if it is at the beginning stages. We call this type of representation the representation of the noble savage. And I'm sure you've heard this terminology before. The noble savage is an idea taken probably in a weird way from the philosophy of Jean-Jacques Rousseau that says that Native American populations are born into the world innately noble, meaning good, but they just haven't been taught yet the proper way to be in the world. They need to be assimilated. They need to be taught the correct, social norms. They need to be taught, in particular, the correct religion, which was, of course, Christianity. It was a belief that they were at a lower level of human development, culturally speaking, and that we as white Westerners would teach them how to reach this higher stage of evolution represented by white culture. So we show them in a typical kind of representation. Those of you who went to the Kennedy Wiley show, for instance, looking off kind of into the distance, unfocused, head slightly tilted back here. That's a typical representation of people of power in Western culture. But we accompany that standard mode of representing power with images or accoutrement that reference their savage nature, their lower level on the evolutionary chain, their exotic hairstyles, their fur clothing, and so forth. But what I want to focus on more than the noble savage here, which I hope you all can recognize, is another form of paternalistic representations, if they are kind of like children that need to be taught the right way by us. It gives us the okay to be in charge of them, to be in control, to treat them like we're their parents. I mean, we see that, right, ideologically. The other thing I want to focus on, though, is the way that these are projections of things that we romanticized in this other. It is a really ambivalent relationship to Native American cultures that we see here. In other words, what I'm saying is early on, we continue to represent Native Americans in very predictable ways, emphasizing their exotic nature and de-emphasizing the ways that they had already begun to assimilate into Western culture. And so we focused on getting them dressed up in headdresses, to bring ceremonial weapons to these types of portrait painting sessions, and de-emphasized other things. This is the beginning of that stereotype. In the work on the left, no one took the time to document what any of this meant, right? What are these types of visual symbols, the face painting, the hair, the clothes, these types of ceremonial weapons, what do they all mean? And so they just have a kind of exotic status to them. They're just different than us, and we kind of romanticize that. We in some sense, and we'll see this in being referenced by James Luna's work, we respond to this by a longing to have some part of whatever is represented by Native American culture in our own lives to a minimal degree. We don't really want to be Native Americans, but we don't mind kind of play acting or fantasizing as if we are them. We get caught up in that kind of identification of one little aspect of them, their kind of liberated status outside of Western culture. I'll come back to that and try to clarify that, because I'm sure that's a bit nebulous at this point. On the right, Karl Bodmer, while continuing to represent Native Americans, and this is a work called Metatope, who is a Mandan chief, continue to represent Native Americans according to stereotypes, right? Dressed in all of their regalia. And what I'm saying here is that, of course, this isn't the way that Native Americans walked around day to day. They've been asked to dress up in their kind of regalia for a Western painter. Karl Bodmer was actually employed by a German naturalist to come visually document, but also to write down what many of these cultural forms meant. So in Metatope, we see an image of a man who is, all dressed up, but we know, for instance, that the yellow owl feathers in his hair over here are symbolic of the number of arrow wounds that he took in battle. So they're a little bit like, and it becomes less exotic that way, like a Purple Heart in the American military. Over here in his hair, his most prized possession is the red knife. That red knife shows that he's killed a Cheyenne chief in hand-to-hand combat. So it's like a Congressional Medal of Honor or something like that. The yellow hand on his chest represents the number of prisoners that he's taken in battle, and on and on and on. So we get a little bit more information about what all this means. But again, we're still representing them fairly stereotypically according to visual forms that predate colonial contact. The only thing that is post-colonial contact is he's got an iron hatchet here, or tomahawk, that of course would have been traded. And trade had been going on at this point for 200 years with Western culture. See this all kind of brought together here. I'll just reference this very briefly in a work by John McStanley, another kind of, again, these are all white artists representing Native American cultures. This work by John McStanley is called Osage Scalp Dance, and we see a scalp dance being performed. We see the innocent mother and child here, dressed in white as can be, next to the darkness of the Native Americans, which would have been read as racial inferiority. And just off to her left, pointed to by her hand, is a Native American that's getting ready to club her, but he's being stopped by the man with the spear in his hand here, and the reasoning is that this man wears a peace medal. So he's been acculturated, he's been taught the right thing to do, and he's stopping the savagery of the United States. So we see kind of the ideological component of these works here, and the stereotypical representation of Native Americans. You can find this everywhere. If you go to Washington, D.C., go to the steps of Congress, you'll see a lot of things like this. This is the Rescue by Horatio Greenough. Once again, Native American, getting ready to hack up a defenseless woman and child. He's the demonic Native American. Look at the look on his face when he's stopped by this kind of personification of American ethics or American morality, a figure that's dressed like a scholar who holds him but does nothing particularly violent to him, because many of these images go out of their way to show the interaction between Native Americans and white culture as being non-violent. The facial expression that he has on his face is not one of anger, it's one of kind of bewilderment. He doesn't seem to recognize that what he's doing is particularly wrong, and we see that look mirrored on the face of the dog down here, which represents the idea that Native Americans, like dogs, need to be trained the right way to be. Now, this is still in front of our governmental buildings, and one of the most famous of all these, on the Senate Rotunda building, so the major space for the Senate, is a work by Thomas Crawford called The Progress of Civilization. I'm not going to take you through this in detail. I'm just going to get up close on this for a minute. But what we see is a representation of America in the center, and off to one side, off to her right, are all the ways that America is going to progress, get better and better, with a militiaman here, and a merchant here, and an engineer here teaching children. Off to her left is a pioneer going off into the west to clear the ground and make use of the natural resources, the whole idea of manifest destiny. And then the final third over here, we see a young Native American man with an animal over his shoulder that he's caught hunting, next to a representation of what's known as the doomed Native American. Native Americans who see that their way of life has no way forward, that they're going to have to assimilate into Western culture, that the old traditional ways are dead. And he has his hand on his head here lamenting that, but not aggressively, fighting against it, because he's accepted this fate. And then, believe it or not, this is a Native American woman holding in her hands a dead Native American child next to an open grave, which is symbolic of these people's lack of a future. So as I said before, that's just a little recap of some of the typical ways that Native Americans have been represented during the 19th century in particular, and the stereotypes of those representations and how they're shot through with ideological assumptions about their inferiority. What many contemporary Native American groups do and artists do is to hark back to pre-colonial contact and continue to create artistic forms that tie them back to their traditional roots. And this is very, very common and an incredibly interesting scene, to be sure. But the artists I want to focus in are those who poke some holes in this strategy, or at least want us to think that this is not the only strategy by which Native Americans need to agitate for their continued minority status in the United States and all the issues that they confront, being the other of white culture. They're kind of one of the fundamental others of white culture. You're looking at James Luna here on the screen here, and I want to start by showing you one of his most famous works of art. What you're looking at here is a work that's called the Artifact Piece. In the artifact piece, James Luna, who is a member of a Southern Californian tribe, the Luiseno tribe, took over a natural history museum for this exhibition the first time he did it. And what he did here was that he laid down in the museum, this is him, the artist himself, the Native American himself, or American Indian is his preferred label, laying down in this vitrine that is devoted to the historical representation of Native American cultures. And just like Fred Wilson, what he's doing is trying to call attention to the way that institutions, cultural institutions such as museums, frame the cultures that they represent in pretty predictable ways, almost always representing them as somehow, caught in the past, as artifacts of a past age that is a bygone age that no longer exists today. A way to flesh this out is to say that when you go to a natural history museum, what we're focused on is the past. And most of those museums go out of their way to show objects or artifacts that are pure, that are authentic. They don't show any kind of contact to Western culture. These are the original artifacts of these people that are being shown, and then they are covered with wall plaques that explain these cultures to us. And what James Luna was primarily trying to do here was draw attention to the fact that these cultures exist today. Right? When we think about Native Americans, and the first image we get in our heads are the stereotypes. How well do those stereotypes match up to the real people who exist in this real world today, who are of American Indian ancestry? How does the stereotype function as a lens by which we see these people, and how does it function as a lens even more so by which they see themselves only through these moments of the past, right? So you can go to the museum here and see James Luna's artifact piece and come in contact not with a dead culture, not with a culture that has been collected by Western culture, but rather by a real Native American or American Indian, I'm sorry, that's his preferred term, who is still alive today and is anything but just that kind of, frozen moment of the past. Around him, in the space, were other objects, and I'll show you images of this as well, some that come from his traditional ritual regalia, so feathers and beaded headbands and so forth, but others in other glass vitrines were everyday objects like a goody comb or his chic shaver. So he's trying to say the idea of Native Americans only existing as this stereotype links them to a past moment and puts all the privilege, all of the importance on this past moment that exists pre-colonial colonial contact, and anything after that is of less interest to, in particular, Western culture. We don't want to see things that are, tend not to want to see things that are Native Americans doing things that are very Western. We want to see, the works before they were contacted by Western culture. The label here, and you see these little, labels next to his body as well, bring up another point, the persistence of issues that confront contemporary Native Americans that these museums do little to highlight. These little labels talked about the scars on his body, many of which were incurred during his early years when he was an alcoholic, which is, of course, something that affects many American Indians disproportionately to other ethnicities. And where he fell down and skinned his knees because he was really drunk. And so he highlights the issue of alcoholism within these communities as well, and asks, I think implicitly, what usefulness does coming to a history museum and being really interested in Native American culture, but only the culture that existed in these pre-colonial times, or only a culture that is associated with the authentic moment of pre-colonial times, and not spending time to get interested in contemporary Native American culture the ways that has changed over the years, and the troubles and issues that these people confront today. He's also, of course, as all these works are, these are what we refer to as institutional critiques. They critique the practices of institutions, in this case, the museum. It's also, of course, trying to confront the idea of the museum as a neutral space, because what you're seeing here on the screen is just a random diorama that I downloaded from Google. One of the museum practices of the 19th century was, of course, to make these things more real, or to give you the idea of a kind of real context for the objects that are under display by setting up these objects on mannequin figures that are, made to look ethnically appropriate, and setting them in surroundings so as to convince you what you're looking at is more authentic or more true. And of course, he's deflating that idea of that truth through this incredibly kind of realistic representation by showing you a real American Indian in the flesh, so to speak, that you can come in contact with. And I love these photographs from this exhibition. You see a little bit off to the right there his ceremonial regalia. You see Jimmy Durham lying in this space himself, and people standing, hands length away from it, a little bit afraid to get up close to the real Native American and wondering about what all this means. I kind of lean over, not sure if he's going to wake up and look at you and think about what that all means to come into contact with a real living person, to have to confront the fact that what we oftentimes get very interested in with these other cultures is their exotic nature, and this sequesters that culture in a past, and we get less interested in their persistence in the present. And what does that mean? When James Lynn was gone, just these objects remain to remind you of the artist's presence, of the Native American's presence, including a photograph of him. But the space in which his body was imprinted shows you that body outline. This is, of course, an indexical sign, the mark of the body's presence in the space that's no longer there. Those of you who are interested in semiotics, you will be able to read this as the way that language works, the way that representations work in large, is that they stand in for absent objects, right? So here's the artist absent, the real live body absent, and it's right at that moment, of course, that the proliferations of stereotypical representations can really get going. I want to pause here, too, to say something else about this persistent interest, and it makes a lot of sense in this kind of purified, authentic moment of Native American arts and crafts and Native American populations in the United States. It's something that we see really get going at the end of the 19th century. It starts mid-19th century, but it really gets going at the end of the 19th century, right at the moment that these cultures' ways of life start to really disappear, when they're primarily sequestered off on reservations and their traditional modes of existence are going away. Western culture of the United States began to collect these cultures, really began collecting all their artifacts. We know about Edwin Curtis's photo documentation of so many of these peoples, oftentimes in their regalia, of course. It's what James Clifford called the salvage paradigm. The salvage paradigm is this idea that it's right at the moment that a culture's way of life begins to disappear that the dominant colonial culture begins to collect them as a form of preservation. But of course, when we collect their objects or collect them in absence of their real lives, what we're doing is collecting something that we can control. We collect those objects and then we represent them to ourselves as if we're preserving some aspect of that culture that we had a heavy hand in dismantling, as a form of assuaging guilt, of continuing to be interested in these cultures. What is also worth pointing out, though, is that the objects that we collect are the objects that were really meaningful to us, the things that we cared about. So there's a huge collection of, war regalia, of headdresses, of all the exotic things. And far less collection of the lives of everyday Native Americans and their cultural traditions, although there's a lot of that as well. James Luna also agitates for various issues that disproportionately affect American Indian peoples. This is his drinking piece, an installation in which you see a room set up as if there are people sleeping off a night of binge drinking with the paraphernalia of bottles and cans of beer everywhere to be found. And then a small television screen in which James Luna speaks about the effect of alcoholism in the United States on American Indian populations, which is massive and of course leads to all types of secondary problems such as incarceration, diabetes, kidney failure, and so forth. Makes, I think, kind of funny, pointed jokes. These are the 4 sacred colors. It's think about the way that these colors do or don't line up with these different supposed, authentic races. This is called Before Columbus, After Columbus. Or, many of these artists, but in particular James Luna and Jimmy Durham, have a pretty biting sense of humor. So this is called Petroglyphs in Motion. It's the artist himself playing the part of kind of the traditional Native American associated with petroglyphs, rock carving, so an ancient form of visual representation of Native Americans. But to draw our attention to the fact that these people are still alive and their culture is continuing to change and become. He wears Western sunglasses and carries a cell phone as he takes us through this Petroglyphs in Motion scene. I end with here with James Luna's So You've Always Wanted to Be an American Indian, which is a photo essay that was published in 1992 in Art Journal. I've given this to you as a reading, so I'm not going to read it over with you before, but what I do want to highlight as you're going through this reading is that this is another form of address, of course, a photo essay that is published in an art periodical that is meant to reach out to a public and draw their attention to this kind of way that our relationship to Native American peoples is very ambivalent. I've always wanted to be an American Indian is something that I know I've said before, right? When I was a little kid, I didn't play the cowboy when we were playing cowboys and Indians. I always wanted to be the Indian for some reason. I felt kind of more in line with this other character, but it was all because of the way that I had romanticized or fictionalized this position. It wasn't really, truthful to their historical record. And what I mean by this is just simply stop and think for a moment before you read this of all the things that you admire about Native Americans or American Indians, the things that you find yourself drawn to. So for instance, very commonly, one of the things that we hear is they have a beautiful relationship to the environment, right? A very economical, very low impact, sustainable relationship to the environment, or at least historically, that's what we think. After all, they had lived on North and South America for years without having much of a huge impact on the environment, living very sustainably within this environment. That's one, right? Another one is they have beautiful spiritual traditions, right? Real closeness and connection to nature. Another one is their beautiful handmade objects, turning everything that they come in contact with into something beautiful and something that lasts for ages and we continue to use and admire. And then think a little bit about why it is that we're drawn to these people for certain things and not for other things, and how often our representations of them focus on the things that we romanticize and not the things that are like us, like our own culture, our own problems. One of the things that James Luna points out, and Jimmy Durham does as well, and this is part of the historical record when you go to cultural studies, is that many of the Native American traditions were dying out at the end of the 19th century, and they were preserved by white culture, but only partially. Many of the cultural anthropologists who collected these cultures focused on particular aspects of these cultures to preserve. They couldn't preserve everything, of course. And the things that they focused on preserving were the things that were found exotic or interesting to white culture. Then these traditions were oftentimes taught back to Native American groups who had been sequestered on reservations, or some of their information about past traditions might have been partial. They learned about their own cultures through, not always, of course, and frankly, not even, dominantly, but enough to make note of it. They learned about their own past traditions through what had been preserved by Western anthropologists sometimes. And so they're being taught back what Western anthropologists had found interesting within these cultures from time to time, and that throws a big kink in the whole idea of returning to an authentic moment. So I'll just go through this photo essay quick here, and you can read it off on your own time. You see images of his own tribe. The La Jolla Indian Reservation where I live, says James Luna, is but one of 17 reservations in North County, California, one of over 300 federal reservations in the U.S. Goes through the statistics of who these people are, shows you more images from his own hometown, focuses in on some of the things that are real lowlights within this culture, difficulties within this culture, and these are difficult to take. Cases of diabetes for 42% of the tribe, primarily based upon alcoholism. And then things that are good, births and established artists and master degrees being awarded. And then this. There's much pain and happiness, there's success and there is failure, there's despair and there is hope for the future. Still I would live no place else because this is my home. This is where my people have come. I also know that this place, like other places, is the reality that we Indians live. This is it. This isn't the feathers, the beads of many colors, or the mystical spiritual glory that people who are culturally hungry want. Focus on that statement. That projection onto the other of things that are missing in our own culture that we seek out ambivalently in these other cultures. Hey, do you still want to be an Indian? One of the most complex of all these artists that we'll just go over fairly briefly here, I think you'll get it, is Jimmy Durham. Jimmy Durham is an artist who, if you're seeking some kind of cultural heritage for him, part of it is locked in, of course, Native American traditions. He's Cherokee. The other part is his interest in postmodern theory, postcolonialist writings, as well as Marcel Duchamp. And so what you see here is Jimmy Durham kind of tongue-in-cheek pretending to be this alter ego that Marcel Duchamp had once kind of performed. Eros c'est la vie. It's just bringing it in here because it's pretty funny. On the right-hand side is Marcel Duchamp doing this kind of cross-dressing gesture in which he tries to trick you into thinking of him as this other character, Eros c'est la vie, which is a play off the French term eros, meaning love, that's life. And over here on the left is Jimmy Durham doing a very poor job trying to convince you that he is culturally masquerading as anything other than himself. Jimmy Durham's got, as you go through the reading, you'll hear this, a really interesting use of humor in his own work, a humor that points out some of the ambivalences in Native American culture and in those who seek to help out Native American or American Indian cultures. We see here in a work that comes from a larger installation, just to kind of enter into this discussion of this artist's work, a very well-intentioned, kind of liberal-leaning advertisement for Navajos who don't want a handout. You see up here, the last thing he wants is a handout. He wants something more constitutive to help out these very noble people, right? And this is the way to do it. So goes the advertisement. And then down below that, Jimmy Durham has put the fact of the situation, which is that, yeah, that's a wonderful, very utopian idea to help them out in the long term, but donations are still accepted for the here and the now. One of his most famous works is this, and it's a work that's called, it's another installation work called On Loan from the Museum of the American Indian. So part of this has to do with a very important moment in American history, a very well-intentioned moment in which in 1990, the U.S. government, federal government, passed the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. This is an act that was meant to preserve only for Native American people who could prove their Native American ancestry, the label of authentic Native American arts and crafts for their works. In other words, only those people who could prove that they were authentically American Indian groups could get this label on their homemade works, and no one else could kind of fake it. It sounds really well-intentioned, right? Preserve for authentic Native Americans the label Authentic Native American Arts and Crafts for their own works, and no one else can use that. But Jimmy Durham wants to point out some of the problems of authenticity as a label. First of all, as Richard Schiff, the author of your reading, points out, who is actually protected under the U.S. Indian Arts and Crafts Act? And the answer is any member of a federally recognized or state recognized tribe or a person who is certified as an Indian artisan by such a tribe, right? What is the problem with that? Many tribes, of course, never sought federal or state recognition. And even more importantly, many people who have a great deal of, let's say, American Indian blood never gain tribal status. So those people aren't protected. And believe it or not, Jimmy Durham is one of those people. Even though he is almost full-blooded Native American when it comes to genetics, because he has never been federally recognized, his works are not protected. And a couple of his shows were shut down because funding that originally came from sources devoted to protecting only authentic Native American goods couldn't gain that funding because he wasn't federally recognized. It gets really weird, too, if you go through the reading, of course, in that many of you out there could probably claim Native American status or American Indian status under this act if you have as little as 1/64th Native American blood and can go to a tribe and get them to authorize your status there. So with this in mind, then, Jimmy Durham put on a show that is basically a fictitious show with a really convincing title on it, On Loan from the Museum of the American Indian. And in this show, you see a bunch of kinds of critiques of the idea of authenticity. So let's start with that a little bit more. Why might authenticity be a problem? Why might Jimmy Durham say, quote, authenticity is a racist concept which functions to keep us enclosed in our world, in our place, for the comfort of a dominant society? What he's saying there is something that we've already covered, right? And we've covered it a number of times. To think that as a person with a particular ethnicity that you have to partake or be kind of compose your whole sense of self and identity around some idea of what it is to be authentically American Indian is something that is as much a kind of prison or a limitation as it is a form of empowerment, right? How many, it's like we saw in the difference between essentialist philosophies of identity and more post-structuralist ideas of identity. Jimmy Durham's more on or at least in this work, wants to take a post-structuralist viewpoint onto the question of identity so as to displace our privileging of authenticity as an important component in identity. I know that's a mouthful, but think of it this way. We do not think, those of us who are of the kind of majority culture in the United States, what it is to be authentically, a U.S. citizen, authentically American, so to speak. I mean, the whole idea of authenticity in our world makes very, very little sense. It only makes sense in reference to kind of minority cultures. So he wants to poke some holes in that, seeing it as both perpetuating stereotypes, but also, again, being problematic in the sense of what do we locate as the authentic moment for American Indian peoples? Is it the moment immediately preceding Western contact? Do we go back 100 years from there? And if we think about it that way, then what about those times from, contact forward in which Native American populations continue to grow, continue to change, continue to, to be inflected by the power structures in the world? What are we to make of that condition of their history? If we're just focused on that authentic moment of the past, we miss, frankly, centuries of impact of colonization that need to be taken account of. So in this work, what you're looking at here is, when you go into a museum exhibition, they almost always have kind of the entry text, and this is the entry text for that. There is, by the way, no Museum of the American Indian. He made that up. And we see here his biting humor. On the left-hand side, you see maps of the United States labeled as current trends in Indian land ownership. The first one is like 1491, so looking pretty good for American Indian populations. And then we go through history, and we see at the bottom contemporary day, so 1989, and all you see are the dottings where reservations exist now. Off to the right, you see a picture postcard of someone kind of surveying, looking out at one of their legends, which has to do with the white buffalo, but the buffalo is not to be found. And as a matter of fact, you see that, of course, the pictures that he's looking at, this putative scene of the American bison, is just a picture postcard. It's a postcard that is playing off one of those mythologies, the idea of Native American populations reduced to a set of predictable stereotypes that can be encapsulated by a postcard image. When you get into the exhibition itself, rather than see traditional authentic works by Native Americans, we get the idea of American Indians as being a cultural construct, right? This is Jimmy Durham's own self-portrait, and everything about this is pointing out the idea of American Indian ethnicity as being a construct. It doesn't mean that it's any less impactful. It just means that there is no authentic kind of innate moment of Native American identity. So right off the bat, we see that it's paper thin. It's actually a sheet metal thin picture of Jimmy Durham's body. It's very obviously riveted together, again, pinpointing the idea of constructed nature of identity. It's got a mask on the face of it. It looks nothing really like Jimmy Durham itself. And then the entire body is inscribed by language. It is these representations, in this case, of words that give meaning to that body. And hopefully this is familiar to us after second-generation feminist interest in post-structuralist theories about the construction of identity and so forth. When we get up close on this, see Jimmy Durham's face, and a whole bunch of little biting, humorous comments. Hello, I'm Jimmy Durham. As an artist, I'm confused about many things and so forth. You see his chest open, the center of our identity, the heart of the matter. His heart is basically, empty. There's very little there. There's certainly no hidden, really solid meaning to him. And then right off to the left-hand side, you see this funny joke, useless nipple, labeling his parts. You go down the body, he has things, more of these words there. My abdominal muscle sticks out about 3 to 12 inches from here. This is where I got my appendix out, he says, with the scar here. And then Indian penises are large and colorful, and you see the picture of a penis, which, by the way, there's much more complexity involved in these works. It has to do with Freudian ideas about the phallus and about power and so forth. Going on in the exhibition, I just find this hilarious and funny in ways that really make you think. Here are the Indians' parents, right? I don't know what we were expecting, but you're not usually expecting someone dressed like typical middle class, everyday Americans in their business suits and in a suit and in her, beautiful, nice dress, smiling back at us. They look nothing like the stereotype of Native Americans that is so prevalent in the United States. But then he calls attention, of course, to exhibition practices here, not only by this being in a show, but by parenthetically labeling this the frontal view of them, as if there's a profile that will give you more information about Native Americans, and brings up the whole question of our representations of these cultures in their moments of supposed authenticity. Types of arrows: tiny, wavy, short, and fat. Once again, frustrating our idea of the authentic, documentation of Native American practices and their artifacts. Or this one's titled "Ladies' War Club and Dagger for Evening Wear." Nothing, of course, being authentic here. Pocahontas's underwear. This plays off the idea of the fetish. Pocahontas, of course, has been fetishized to death by Western culture, turned into a stereotype of the real human being. It also plays off the idea that traditional cultures' objects are understood as fetishes, things with their own power, but links this to our own desire from the other for something from them. In other words, we tend to show these objects in museums in a very fetishized way. We show them as if they carry with them something of their original import in these cultures rather than just being objects. Or another way to put this is, if you have ever wanted to buy a traditional object from whatever culture it is, and you're really caught up in that, it's beautiful, you love that thing, you want it, stop and ask yourself exactly why you want that thing. I'm as prone to this as anyone else. It's not only because of the beauty of that object, it's also because a very particular group of people made that object. So for instance, if I buy a beautiful African mask and then discover on the back a little sticker that says "Made in Taiwan," even if that thing looks beautiful, suddenly it feels deflated to me because it's no longer connected to this other history. It's what we call commodity fetishism, right? An object that has linkages to its maker or to the culture that makes it, and that's one of the reasons that we really like these things, because of that linkage. Think about this in another realm. In your readings, Richard Schiff points out that collecting is its own form of colonization. What does he mean by that? And what he means is that if you make clear to another culture what your desires of that other culture is, and you begin collecting those things that somehow fulfill that desire, whatever that is, you are basically performing a form of neo-colonialism. And I'm not saying it's horrible, I'm just saying it's there, in which you have told the other culture what you want from them, and they are producing what you want for you. I post this every time a Guns Right thing shows up on social media. This is Jimmy Durham's work called "I Forgot What I Was Going to Say," using the Colt revolver here, which was used in part to eradicate Native American populations from the West, now placed on a handle that would point this object back at its intended user. So the final artist that I want to talk about today briefly is Brian Youngin, who is an artist from the Vancouver area. He shows up at Catriona Jeffries. I came across his work at the Vancouver Museum of Art when he had a big retrospective there. He does something really interesting in his works, and I'm just going to show you kind of a snapshot of 5 years of his career. One of the things that made him kind of a household name fairly quickly are these Nike masks that he made. This is a really interesting work. I'm not going to try to kind of solve all the puzzle pieces for you, but I'm going to tell you what it is and tell you some of the context for this, and then have you put it together the best you can. Obviously, these are not authentic Native American handgoods, or are they? You know, they partake of some of the visual qualities of Native American mass traditions. The producer is a Native American or a First Peoples group. He is, therefore, you know, since he is the maker, are these or are these not authentic? But clearly, their materials are not traditional materials. So what do we do with this? What he has done is he's taken Nike Air Jordan shoes, he's basically deconstructed these, taken them apart very carefully, and then sewn them back together into these forms that look a little bit like Native American. Native American is not right, he's a Canadian artist. First Peoples masks, that's what I should be saying. So then, what do we make of this? Well, one thing to make of this is to start from what an Air Jordan shoe is, right? And those of you who know the history of Air Jordan shoes, you'll know that in the 1980s, when this campaign first came around from Nike, which really made them the juggernaut that they are today, they got Michael Jordan to endorse their products, had an entire line based upon him. And these things were marketed primarily to inner city youths, those people who might have been found by David Hammonds on the basketball courts when he was doing higher goals, for instance. Marketed these people in order to, you know, lift sales by Nike, but also, of course, the ad campaign was in which commodity fetishism ruled supreme, right? People were buying these shoes because, yeah, they're good shoes, but primarily because they had the idea of the dream of Michael Jordan attached to them. You bought the Nike Air Jordan shoes because you wanted to be, as the tagline of this ad campaign said, like Mike, right? You buy these shoes and you're buying a lifestyle. You're buying the possibility of this dream of becoming the incredible NBA star. And people who had had not enough money really to purchase these shoes were spending extraordinary amounts of money on buying these shoes. Now, this got really weird when reported cases of shoe jacking started to occur all over the United States, where kids who had spent $120 on a pair of shoes got them ripped off from them on their way home from school or wherever it might be. So we've got a kind of colonization or a form of neocolonialism here in which economic factors are brought to bear to entice young people, primarily of color, to buy shoes, to buy into a lifestyle. And in the end, all you're doing is supporting a company that becomes incredibly profitable and is highly suspect in its business practices at this time, because the next shoe to drop here, so to speak, is where were these things made? And of course, we know, and things have changed somewhat, but not certainly as well as they should be changed, that many of these products are made in third world countries in sweatshops. And so we've got another form of neocolonialism in which people from countries that are economically poor are exploited by countries that are economically rich, and these companies get richer and richer off of that exchange. Try to put those together with the idea of a commodity fetish, the way that this works in terms of both consumption and production, as well as the way that Native American or, you know, Indian products are created for a particular constituency, that we desire certain things from them, that we buy these according to all of the big resonances that these objects have for us, rather than, you know, anything necessarily found within the object itself. I'll just show you a couple other of these beautiful objects. They're really cool, by the way. Above and beyond the political components of these works, they're incredibly beautiful, just really well constructed and very surprising, and of course, very culturally relevant. Another thing that Brian Youngin did, continues to do in various ways, is to draw attention to the differences between at least our associations of various cultures. So in the West, I think most of us would have to admit that we live in an age of conspicuous consumption, right? Things are bought for a very short period of time of usefulness, and then they're turned in for the latest kind of new product. That we are a culture of intense waste, to put it lightly. And of course, one of the things that we admire in traditional cultures, and in particular Indian cultures, is their economy, the way that they created objects that were sustainable and useful for long periods of times and had beautiful craftsmanship and so forth. This is such a simple work, and yet its meaning is so easily understood, I think. These are red cedar pallets, and they are beautifully constructed, just beautifully. And in the exhibition space, they smell like beautiful red cedar. Of course, this is one of the key materials of Northwest Native groups in their production of artifacts and buildings and totem poles and so forth, because of its beauty and its longevity. Red cedar, especially old growth, has very, very tight grains and tends not to rot very quickly. Now think of that next to every pallet you've seen in the last month sitting by the side of a road somewhere here in the Seattle area, and how beaten up and broken and just cast off those pallets are. They're just made to fulfill a function, and when that function is done, they go by the side of the road or in a landfill somewhere, versus these beautiful, beautiful objects. And it just brings into kind of high relief the differences between economies, and perhaps one can imagine the reason that many of us romanticize, in this case, Northwest Indian traditions for the alternative worldview that they seem to espouse. Just the same thing here. It's a little bit of a funny joke. This is a work that is called the Furniture Sculpture. He basically took apart beautiful, beautiful leather couches and reformed them into the prototypical teepee itself. Or the big one to think about here, I suppose. This work, which oftentimes he's made many things like this. They look like a whale skeleton. This one is called Shapeshifter. When you look at this from far away, and they're huge, right? They're huge works. It looks like that whale skeleton. And you think about Native American groups, particularly Northwest Native groups, and their traditions of whaling. We've, over the last 10 years or so, had many discussions in the Northwest about the Makah tribe returning to their traditions of whaling, and well-intentioned environmentalists trying to stop them from doing that, and other people saying, it's more important for them to continue with their traditions. Well, one of the things this work calls out for me is exactly the stakes of what we're talking about here. When environmentalists point out the tradition of whaling is going to be hurtful to the species, what is oftentimes not pointed out in this whole discussion is the fact that the whole reason that whale populations are so depleted has everything to do with Western cultures and big businesses, and frankly, whaling cultures in other parts of the world, and very, very little to do with a Makah tribe taking a single whale, every 3 or 4 years or whatever it is now, right? And I don't mean just whaling, of course, or fishing. I also mean the pollution of the waters, the traffic, boat traffic that's in the waters that is decimating these giant marine mammals' way of life, just like Native American populations. When you get up close here, the reason you start to think about all those things is you realize that these skeletons are actually constructed out of those little nylon white chairs that you can buy for $5 at a drugstore and use for 1 year, and then when they get too grimy and gross, throw them away so that you can buy another one. Right? That's what this is made out of, riveted together pieces of nylon chair so as to mimic the shape of a whale's body, but it brings into question these different economies and their effect on the environment, and brings that into the question of our own, sense of justice when it comes to nature. I stopped this lecture, and the last image in the class is for all of us. Good work this quarter. I have been so tickled by how much I have learned from you in the discussion forums in particular. It's really been an extraordinarily successful class, in my opinion, and I hope you feel the same way. So if you're of a mind, go grab yourself a drink after you get done with your lecture and congratulate yourself. You only have a few things left to complete for this class. This is Brian Youngin's beer cooler. He brought it with him to his first exhibition in England, as he said, kind of semi-jokingly, to bring alcohol back to the country that gave it to Native Americans or, First peoples and caused all the problems that they caused. But what's so cool about this is not only is it, a whole thing of Budweiser's and opening up the idea of a kind of participation performance that leads to a dialogue, it's also one of those really cheap plastic coolers, which if you're anything like me, again, these coolers, you buy them, after a few years they get so gross, you feel like it's probably just easier to buy a new one than to spend the hour it's going to take me to scrape all this weird green stuff out of the bottom of it. But in this case, once again, that culture of waste is called into question because he has taken, some kind of carving implement and over the exterior of this beautified the entire exterior into these beautiful designs and so forth. All right. I hope you've had fun this quarter. I've certainly had fun with you. I hope it's opened up your eyes to a whole host of questions that we've only just scratched the surface of, and I hope you'll continue to delve into these questions over the course of your lives. Talk to you later. Bye.